Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to talk about the ways in which the Soviet Union was transformed in the aftermath of Stalin's death. So, here's our objectives for today, and let's dive into our narrative. Stalin had been the leader of the Soviet Union going all the way back to the death of Lenin. His iron grip on power made him the indispensable man, and propaganda showed a Soviet society that was completely tied to Stalin. Unfortunately, Stalin, of course, was a horrible leader who, had repeated purges and police terror to keep himself in power. And in his later years, he got increasingly paranoid, targeting groups of people seemingly at random. For example, the Leningrad affair, he targeted top party officials in Leningrad for what seemed like no appreciable reason. And in the Jewish doctors conspiracy, he targeted Jewish doctors within the Soviet Union, accusing them of poisoning top party officials with basically no evidence. All of these people were shipped off to the Gulag archipelago to await trial and probable death. And so when Stalin dies in 1954, it's really about time. Unfortunately for the Soviet Union, he dies incredibly suddenly, and because Stalin is Stalin, he had put no appreciable system of inheritance, no heir in place, no system of succession to determine who the next leader of the Soviet Union would be. And so there was a quiet power struggle behind the scenes between Stalin's various sort of deputies and underlings to see who would emerge in order to sort of take on the role of Stalin. In the end, the guy who did emerge was a guy named Nikita Khrushchev. He's going to become the top guy in the Soviet Union, and he's going to usher in an era of more leniency in general. For example, they're going to free a significant number of people in the Gulag archipelago. A lot of these people who were condemned to life terms, to live in these work camps forever, a lot of them are going to be freed and reintegrated into society after Stalin's death. Khrushchev is also going to sort of remake Soviet society and try to make the Soviet Union into a more friendly and less despotic place, despite the fact that he is still the unquestioned leader of the Soviet Union and is still, leading by fiat without having to build a consensus. But they are going to try to improve economically and look at a variety of different areas of the economy that had been somewhat neglected under Stalin. In a secret speech, Nikita Khrushchev starts this pattern of de-Stalinization, in which he starts criticizing Stalin and comparing him unfavorably to Lenin. So take a moment, pause, and read. This criticism of Stalin after his death really opens up the Soviet Union and ends the era of terror that Stalin had ushered in when he ascended to power back in the 1920s. Gone are going to be the show trials, gone are the mass purges and executions. The Soviet Union is still going to be an autocratic society, but it's going to move away from the sort of totalitarian terror of Stalin. Another effect of this is Mao and the Chinese communists are really going to dislike this. I mean, Mao specifically. Becomes very worried, and we're going to talk a lot more about this once we get into Chinese history, but he's going to become very worried that the same thing is going to happen to him in the aftermath of his inevitable death at some point. And so he's going to criticize Khrushchev. The Sino-Soviet split is going to break China away from the Soviet Union and create this massive rift between the two largest communist countries in the world, and is going to lead to a whole host of different sort of geopolitical issues that we're going to deal with going forward in this unit. In the Soviet Union, we're going to see economic reform. The Virgin Lands scheme attempts to bring back some of Lenin's new economic policies, some of the NEP stuff from back in the 1920s, attempting to allow more capitalism, more freedom, more incentives. They're going to try to produce more consumer products and, focus on technological growth as opposed to simply doubling down on the military growth we saw under Stalin. Part of this is simply a change in direction from new leadership, but part of it is also just because Stalin was leader of the Soviet Union during times of vast conflict between the aftermath of the Russian Civil War and World War II. And so now that the Soviet Union is going to be transformed into a peacetime nation and to some extent demobilize, there's going to be a transformation into more consumer goods and consumer products. They're going to try to more adequately fix the market issues that developed under communism. So take a moment, pause, and read. You can clearly see the effects of shortages within the Soviet Union, lack of access to even the basic necessities of life for a lot of people. And so there's this push to improve lives for the Russians in general. The Russians are also going to launch the first satellite under Khrushchev here. Sputnik is going to be the first man made object put into orbit, demonstrating again the technological marvels that the Soviet Union is capable of. This is going to kick off a space race between the United States and the Soviet Union as both sides rush to be the first to hit all these space milestones. And generally, the Soviet Union is going to be ahead of the United States in a lot of these different things because they're able to have this sort of government centered and funded research in targeting these very specific areas in a way that a capitalist society can't do as effectively. We get all of these milestones, you get the development of these new rockets, and of course, this is eventually going to lead to the expanded ballistic missile technology that we are going to talk about when we get to mutually assured destruction and the whole duck and cover thing. So, in general, we're also going to see relationships improving with the United States as the Soviet Union becomes a more consumer based society and as they start trying to directly compete more with the United States. The United States and the Soviet Union become closer. Khrushchev is going to take a tour across the Midwest, famously he's going to Midwestern farms to sort of observe American agricultural techniques and things like that. There's going to be sort of these goodwill missions between the two sides, which were really unthinkable in the era of Stalin. And so our views on the Soviet Union are to some extent changing here, and the relationship is thawing. There's going to be an era of competition as Soviets try to sort of mirror some of these American innovations. For example, the supermarket was this amazing American innovation in which you're buying all of the food products you need in one place. They had nothing like this in the Soviet Union, and so they're going to attempt to open up supermarkets. And they're going to have some success in providing a broad array of sort of consumer goods and foodstuffs. But the Soviet Union, because of its problems with incentives, is going to constantly face massive shortages, especially in items that are popular. And so, although they can build the infrastructure, putting the incentives in place to produce the goods that people want is going to be really challenging under a command economy. We're also going to see competition in the Olympics with the Soviet Union specifically training athletes in order to try to win at a variety of different sports. This competition between the US and the Soviet Union in the Olympics is one of the ways that the Cold War is fought during this era, as both sides use their athletes' Olympic success to sort of tout the various advantages of their various systems. Of course, the United States is hampered by the fact that only amateur athletes can compete, and because in the Soviet Union all athletes are amateur, we're going to be the United States is at a significant disadvantage. But at the same time, the Soviets do an excellent job at training their athletes and maybe use some steroids and potentially illegal substances, which, of course, Russia would never do today. They're totally on the up and up. And there's absolutely no way that Russian athletes would be trying to skirt any sort of, doping or, drug related regulations. We're also going to have an expansion in missile technology and military spending. Both sides are going to continue to develop new technologies, larger bombs. They develop larger hydrogen bombs, develop new delivery systems, develop nuclear submarines, develop all these various things. And so the arms race is another way in which the Cold War is going to be fought during this time period. This continued military buildup is really not a departure from what we saw previously. And so again, in some ways, the Soviet Union has become a very different place under Nikita Khrushchev. And in some ways, it's very similar. And the way the Cold War is fought is similar. Here's Khrushchev talking about the inevitability of the rise of socialism. He famously gave a speech at the UN that was where his words were translated to "We will bury you." And so here he's clarifying what he means by bury you. So pause, take a moment, let's move on. And we get the Vice President of the United States, Richard Nixon, who travels to the Soviet Union to have to visit an expose of consumer products. And Nixon and Khrushchev have this sort of friendly debate about the merits of capitalism and communism as they look at washing machines, stoves, refrigerators, other things like that. You can definitely find footage of this, so if you're interested, go and seek out the kitchen debate and watch it. It's pretty hilarious, and it gives you a sense of how Khrushchev is very different from Stalin, because you really can't imagine Stalin having a kind of friendly back and forth discussion on television with an American figure that we see from Khrushchev here. So take a moment, watch the kitchen debate if you're interested. Khrushchev has a very fancy hat on, and we'll move on. In the end, this whole thing breaks down because of the shooting down of an American spy plane. So take a moment, pause, and read. An aircraft was shot down over the Soviet Union. The Eisenhower administration, the president at the time, tries to claim that this was a weather craft studying sort of atmospheric pressure over the Soviet Union. But it turns out the plane is captured mostly intact and the pilot is captured alive, and he admits to spying. This leads to a significant increase in tensions as we refuse to admit our participation in this and refuse to stop using these spy planes to gather reconnaissance on the Soviet Union. And so in the early 1960s, the thaw breaks down and we see an increasing ratcheting up of tensions that we're definitely going to pick up and talk about as we get closer to 1962. So that's reform within the Soviet Union. For next time, we're going to look at the geopolitical effects of all of this on the third world and continue to talk about the three world model and how this shapes the actions of both the United States and the Soviet Union as we enter into this new Cold War. Thank you for listening.